Open up the door, it's Dave!
Who?
Dave! D-A-V-E!
Dave?
Right, man, Dave.
Dave's not here!
Recently, we had a tropical storm that was headed to Florida. It started to develop off the coast of the Bahamas and was headed in toward Florida. And it was kind of an unusual thing to see something that late. Yes, hurricane season technically goes from June 1st through November 30th, but typically your peak hurricane season is sometime in August and September. And occasionally you'll see a hurricane that gets developed sometime in October, mid to late October. But this was unusual because this was actually in November that this hurricane started to develop, that this tropical storm started to develop. It became a hurricane before it made landfall. And why I mention it is because I saw something in my Tesla that I'd never seen before. And that was that we should be aware that there's a storm coming and some of the charging stations may not be available. It's actually kind of cool that they did that they took the advantage of the opportunity to give us advance warning. If we're charging at some of these charging stations, they may not be available. So I thought that was kind of cool. It gives more credence to the fact that there's sort of this idea of how do you manage your charging and how do you understand how charging works and how does Tesla become part of this whole community of charging that's a bigger picture than just, you know, charging your car at a charging station. It's sort of a bigger picture type item. Now, speaking of bigger picture type items, as I look at what we're doing in the EV community and kind of how the EV community is growing, I've noticed that Tesla stock dropped pretty dramatically. And that's kind of a surprise. And it has a couple of factors behind it. The first of which is China still has some issues with lockdowns and other things where they're not producing the same quantity of product that they were. And the factories aren't as available and they're not producing the quantity of cars that they wanted to. That's certainly a factor. There's still some limited inventory of some of the chips and other things, though that has improved. And then the third factor is Elon Musk himself and making the decision to buy Twitter. Now, that's his business, what he chooses to do with his time and his money. But his dalliance with another company that's something else outside of the big companies that he works on, so that would be Tesla and SpaceX, really does kind of cause some investors to be concerned. So his stock went down shortly after he completed the purchase, which I thought was kind of interesting. It may still be a good buy because they're still delivering products, cars, and they're still doing some good work, and there's still a value to be had there. It's just probably a better value now than it was a few months ago when the stock price was really high. Just sharing that with you as sort of a side note, I find that kind of interesting that he caused the market to react to what he was doing. Now, you know, speaking of that idea of the how the car tells you something in that space where it's telling you there's a storm coming and be aware. If you think about the whole social media space, there's an opportunity to kind of integrate the two to a degree. And I'm not saying it's completely integrated where you talk about social media being a part of the car, but certainly you have that ability now to cross-communicate a little bit. And I think there's some interesting and intriguing opportunities there. Whether it comes to pass, who knows, but I just thought that was interesting. Now, in other EV news, something I was reading about was that in the European Union and in China and in Japan, there's a concern about the U.S.'s effort and this infrastructure plan to provide tax credits for cars that are made in the United States. We're in a global economy, and you have to understand that the economy works together to a large degree. You can't just separate one country from another and stand as sort of this protectionist sort of, we're standing on our own and we're doing our own thing. The world doesn't work like that anymore. As you may have noticed through some of the other things that have been happening around the world, this doesn't quite come to pass as something that's meaningful sometimes. You really have to think of it as an interconnected world. So the European Union and China and Japan came back and said, we don't like this infrastructure plan because you're only providing tax credits to very specific companies that would make cars in the United States. And it's kind of a balance, right? What's the right answer? I don't know what it is. I'm not saying the US is right or wrong. I don't know what the answer is. But when I look at what they're doing, I think to myself, that's really interesting that they've made the decision to do this. And so these countries, these communities are trying to pressure Biden to change the rules so that more EVs would qualify for the tax credits to make sure we create this global economy. you still have a lot of cars that are produced in other countries that come into this country and would be really valuable to have. And with the global economy and the fact that some of them are going to make electric cars anyway, you could really take advantage of it. Maybe there's an opportunity to lessen the amount of credit you get if it's not produced in the United States or something. But you have to find a way, a balance. And this is the challenge. How do you find that balance to make it work? And I don't know what the answer is. I thought it was interesting. And thinking about EV stocks, well, I mentioned that Tesla has gone down in price. If I think about the company Rivian is a really interesting company. Apparently they have a lot of cash on hand and they have a lot of things going on, and their sales are decent at this point, and they may be a really good company to invest in. I'm going to study them myself and make a decision whether I want to invest in them. I'm not providing any sort of stock advice. I'm just thinking it's as a kind of an exercise in the mental sense. If you think about a stock like that, maybe you want to look into it and make a decision for yourself whether it's the right stock to invest in. I'm not suggesting you do or you don't. I'm just saying, maybe it's one that's worth looking at because it's kind of an interesting thing. So I'm just kind of curious where that's going to net out, because it's kind of a weird thing that they're doing really well compared with some of the other EV stocks, and that's kind of intriguing to me. So I want to look into them a little more. And that kind of leads me around to the discussion about what happens with the EV prices. We talked about China, we talked about EV stock being affected, and all these other things happening. And what you're seeing is that EV prices continue to kind of creep up a little bit. They're not going down, they're not reaching that stable point. But then, to be fair, ICE cars are not either. They're also creeping up in price. So there's a balance in there somewhere. And then you look at the price to charge. And I mentioned on a recent road trip, I used to be able to charge for about 25 cents a kilowatt hour at the various charging stations around. But since they increased the charging level, they're now charging something like 40 cents a kilowatt hour. So the value proposition is different. It's costing me much closer to the amount I'd have to pay for gas for the same distance traveled. So, we're not at a point where we can say that it's actually cheaper. Maybe at some point we could, but now we maybe can't. So there's a gap there somewhere that needs to be closed in terms of how this works. Now, being able to charge at home with a larger battery may make a difference, and there may be some other opportunities, but you got to keep in mind that there's always something else. There's always opportunities out there, and there's more things you can do when you think about how the EV community works and how you charge and when you charge and where you charge. Those things can make a difference. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about was that China has decided that they're going to invest more heavily in hydrogen distribution so that there's more ability to charge hydrogen type cars. Now, I mentioned before that Toyota has invested heavily in the hydrogen market, and they were betting big that the hydrogen market would unseat the electric market for cars, that you could make hydrogen cars. And in fact, they developed a couple of concept cars that they were trying to sell and promote in some way. And so they're lauding the fact that China wants to do this as being a big opportunity for them, and that could be the next big thing. And it may be. The problem I have with hydrogen is that you have to distribute it somewhere. So the cost to produce, there is a cost to produce it. You have to actually take it and take your water and your oxygen, and you have to do a little chemical reaction in order to get the hydrogen. Then you have to store it, and you have to keep it at a temperature. Then you have to transport it somewhere. So there's a cost of transport. And then you have to put it in somewhere and then be able to have it available. So there has to be many places to charge. With gas cars, I can go to any gas station and get gas for my car. With EV, I can charge at home, or I can go to a charging station there, and there are many of them now. But with hydrogen, there aren't as many places to charge with hydrogen or put hydrogen in your car. And there has to be very many, and there has to be a large distribution network for it. So I'm concerned that this won't be the answer. It's a clever idea, and hydrogen is a great answer for having some sort of energy source, but not necessarily for a car, just because you can't distribute it easily. Now, if there was an easier way to create hydrogen and make it available in some way, then maybe this would be a viable alternative. And maybe China helps figure that out and cross that barrier so that they actually create something that's easier to work with. And if they do, great. Then maybe we move the whole green car concept in a different direction. But for now, because of the distribution cost and the fact that you have to have these stations, they can only, it's like a container. You can only hold so much. And, it's economies of scale. If I only have 100 cars on the road and they're in these different locations, where do I put my hydrogen charging cells so that I can charge these cars? So there's no one size fits all answer here. You have to kind of think it through. And that's what I wanted to talk about for EVs today. I hope you enjoyed the stories, and talk to you again soon.
What's your point, David?